Okay, I've called this week's talk Private Lives and Public History, Portrait Photos in the Archive. The visual collection that we hold in Lambeth Archives is very large, so large that we haven't actually ever been able to sit down and count it, but it's probably approaching at least 100,000 images. Mainly photographic, but also watercolours, engravings, oil paintings, pencil drawings, and newer media such as film as well. I'm going to be focusing on photography in this evening's talk, and very particularly, very specifically on the portrait photograph, which is a curious component of the archive collections. I mean, the archives, as those of you who were listening to Len's talk last week have probably gathered, the archives at Lambeth span a huge range of media and document types and sources of information. And the image collection is one specific one that we hold, and the photographs within it are a fascinating record of Lambeth. But it's fair to say that the portrait photographs that we hold are also some of the most curiously personal images, and yet at the same time they are, by dint of coming into the archive, images that have lost a lot of their initial personal meaning, have become instead somehow public documents that we can consume along with all the other documentary sources in the archive and interpret. That's one of the things that I want to talk about in the talk this evening. I suppose the other is really to give you, my audience, a sense of the extraordinary range and richness of the collection we hold, and also to I want to use it as a way of talking a little bit about the history of photography and a little bit about the way that the technical constraints on early photography actually shaped and limited what got documented. In a sense, what we have in the archive and what we don't have in the archive, particularly in terms of photographs, is in part at least determined by these very kind of technical considerations about what cameras and what photographers could and could not do at a moment in time. I mean, that feels particularly relevant at the moment as we increasingly live in a digitally enabled age in which we are encouraged, nay, expected to document all our activities in real time as we go along. The contrast with the limitations on some of the images that I'm going to show you in a minute are really quite revealing. Okay, I will begin. Clearly, I'm beginning with something that isn't a photograph, and obviously, in terms of talking about portraiture, we don't begin in the 19th century. This painting may be familiar to you. It's a very famous painting. It's not in the Lambeth Archives collection, sadly. It's in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, but it used to hang in a house in Lambeth for a good 50 years before Elias Ashmole moved it out of the house and gave it to his new museum in Oxford. It's a deathbed portrait of John Tredeskant the Elder, the South Lambeth gardener who lived on South Lambeth Road. It was painted in 1638, the year of his death. He was a man by then of considerable status in the way that gardening and botany was a high status activity. I mean, he'd been the gardener to some of the king's palaces at Oakland, for example. And in the year of his death, he'd recently been appointed to the Oxford University Botanical Gardens, recently opened. He was head of that. And he had his own extraordinary collection, both botanical and museum collection, in his house at South Lambeth, which was then managed by his son, John Tredescant the Younger. They are well-known Lambeth figures. I suppose the point about starting with this is make a very obvious point, that where photography allows us to easily transmit multiple copies of whatever it is we're depicting. The portrait picture in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century is a unique image, only available to people of a certain degree of wealth or status. There were exceptions, of course, and there were means of creating multiple images. This is an engraving of Margaret Finch, Queen of the Gypsies, supposedly living at Gypsy Hill to the age of 106. If we look in the bottom left corner, you can see it tells us drawn from life by, I can't read his name now, Stratho it looks like. And on the other side of the image we see then engraved by Henry Roberts in 1742, and this image appeared in Gentleman's Magazine. The point about, and this was quite a common process for an original portrait to then be copied by an engraver, and so multiple copies of certain people that were deemed to be of interest, either celebrities of some sort or another, make their way into the archive in the form of engraved images, frequently engravings taken from originally portraits. And this, within our collection, probably the largest painting that we have. It's a good 4 feet tall. It's the Lambeth winner of the Doggett Coat and Badge Thames rowing race in 1833. George Maynard lived on Wandsworth Road, and this is a different sort of status. I mean, a sort of celebrity status that we recognise in the way that professional sport today endows its practitioners with celebrity. But back in 1833, George Maynard winning the Thames rowing race clearly had sufficient status and celebrity to commission, or someone to wish to commission of him a portrait. This oil painting in our collection we've recently had restored, and it should be going up in the town hall on display in the town hall when the town hall reopens later this year. 1833 is an interesting date. It was within the very early 1830s that two French chemists, artists, Nietzsche and Daguerre, started to jointly experiment on ways of capturing images through light and through chemistry. In other words, what we now call photography. And in 1839, Louis Daguerre had come up with a methodology that could be replicated and patented and become what we now recognise as the first recognised photographic medium, the daguerrotype, named after him, Louis Daguerre. This is another image that's not in our collection, but it's it's also carefully chosen by me because it was taken by a Lambeth photographer. In this case, the critic and artist John Ruskin, who lived in Herne Hill in Lambeth, but who spent a great deal of his life travelling in Europe, and particularly in Venice, which he wrote about, The Stones of Venice, Mark's Rest, and a number of other books. And slightly surprisingly, for someone who was otherwise generally in opposition to technological innovations of the 19th century, unusually did embrace photography and was an early practitioner of the daguerreotype. Worth saying a little bit about the daguerreotype. suppose the first thing I need to explain is the size of it. Everything looks the same size on our screen. So where the previous image was 4 foot tall, this one's 2 inches tall. These were small, unique, highly precious images that took a great deal of effort to obtain. The first thing to observe is that it is a direct positive. In other words, there's no negative, and so you can't make multiple copies of it. So it's rather like the oil painting. It's actually a unique image. The technology consisted of a silvered, highly polished copper plate, which was then activated with iodine and then exposed to light, because it was then light sensitive, rather like a piece of camera film, and was then subsequently fixed in mercury fumes. So it sounds like a pretty unpleasant chemical cocktail. They produced these quite exquisite images. One of the limitations of the daguerreotype, which we can see if we just zoom into this one, is the extraordinary long exposure times. This is one of Ruskin's many daguerreotypes of St. Mark's Square in the centre of Venice on the Grand Canal. But if we look at the people in the foreground, we can see how many of them have ghosted. You know, these 2 images are the same man. Those 2 images are the same man. Those 2 with the white trousers are the same. These 2 here are the same. The time exposure was so long that it was virtually impossible to use daguerreotypes initially for open-air photography. Studio photography quickly developed the daguerreotype, and in the very early daguerreotype studios, particularly in America, these included neck braces to hold the head still for the sometimes 30-second exposure that was necessary to achieve the daguerreotype. So the early portraits done in daguerreotype are extraordinarily static, necessarily so. Here's another daguerreotype. Again, this is the third and final image that's not in our collection. I think it's also a very well-known image. It's the one of the 2 photographs that were taken at the great artist meeting on Kennington Common in 1848. And this one has indeed, I mean, the technology has improved slightly, and this one captures the crowd better without loss of detail. We can look into this extraordinary image, into this kind of sea of faces, and the stand there with the banners on it, and in the background the sulfuric acid factory, the vitriol factory that stood on what's now St Agnes Place. We're looking across Kennington Park from the Horns Tavern. Indeed, the photographer was in the upper room of the Horns Tavern with his camera on a tripod, the only way he could have possibly taken this image. And this is claimed to be one of the first ever photographs of a crowd taken, and it's delightfully, it's a photograph taken in Lambeth. The original is in the Royal Collection. Let's move on to some images that do come from the archives. These are a pair of ambrotypes. Ambrotypes were a kind of a development out of the daguerreotype process. Cheaper, they had a kind of silver salt solution on glass rather than an image on metal. Again, they're direct positives, so they're unique. They're actually negative images which sit in front of a sheet of black velvet, which then reverses the polarity, so they appear as positive images when you look at them. They're sealed up in these exquisite little brass and copper cases, emulating the way that many of the more expensive daguerreotypes would have been framed. They had to be sealed to preserve the content from atmospheric degradation. And they're also framed in glass to protect them. Again, these are size is important here. These are probably no more than 2.5 inches high. So very exquisite, very precious images. Some of the earliest images that we have in the collection, and completely anonymous. We do not know who these people are. These have come to us as examples of photographs rather than particular photographs of particular people, and that's a common problem that I'll return to in this talk. Anonymous images. These people are also anonymous, but we know quite a lot about why this photograph, one of quite a large series, was taken. These are from the volumes of the 2 volumes of written by Philip Delamotte between 1852 and 1854 to document the relocation of the Crystal Palace building from Hyde Park, where it had served as the Great Exhibition during 1851, onto the top of Sydenham Hill, where it was re-erected by the Crystal Palace Company between 1852 and 1854, and reopening considerably enlarged, but still basically Paxton's modular building that had been disassembled from Hyde Park and re-erected on top of Sydenham Hill. And this was an extraordinarily significant building for Greater London. I mean, it's the largest structure to go up in London, effectively. And it's interesting that as early as 1852, it had been deemed of sufficient significance to be worth commissioning a photographer, Lamotte, to document the entire process. And we have about 60 images across 2 volumes of mainly images of cast iron structures and glazing going up as the Crystal Palace goes up. But I've chosen this particular image for obvious reasons, given the subject I talk, because it nicely illustrates what is effectively also an early group portrait photo, and more to the point, group photo of a section of society that were probably not yet being exposed to photography. These were navvies, or building labourers. These were not men who would have been able to afford to go to a photographic studio. It would not have been part of their, would not yet have been part of their what was available to them. So these men almost certainly being photographed for the very first time in about 1853. The other thing to note here is that Delamotte by the 1850s has moved on from the single unique image created by, say, the daguerrotype process or the ambrotype process, and he's using a calotype paper negative and then taking from that negative multiple prints. So not only does Lambeth Archives hold a set of Delamotte's volumes, the British Library has a set as well. I think there may be 1 or 2 other sets, but they are very rare and probably some of the most valuable in monetary terms photographs that we hold in the collection. Here's another photographer, a decade on, venturing into Lambeth. Again, photographer of buildings who accidentally ends up documenting people. What William Strudwick is about in the mid 1860s is very different from what Delamotte was doing a decade earlier. Delamotte was essentially celebrating celebrating probably the Crystal Palace Company. He was probably commissioned by the Crystal Palace Company to record their fantastic commercial venture, erecting the palace on top of Sydenham Hill, and all the money that they would then expect to make from it. Strudwick, on the other hand, is doing something quite in the 1860s quite unusual. He's going into a very poor slum area with an expensive camera. It's a slum area that is about to be demolished. These are the streets of old Water Lambeth that are about to be cleared by 1868 for the line of the new Albert Embankment, that glorious South London boulevard with a giant Bazalgette sewer underneath it that effectively destroyed the medieval settlement of Lambeth and replaced it with the smooth streetscape that we can still experience today. Strudwick was unusual because he was interested enough in photography and interested enough in the history or the streetscape of Lambeth to, at a very early stage, use the camera to document it. These are some of the earliest, what we would now today call clearance photographs, some of the earliest photographs of buildings just before they are about to be demolished. And Strudwick documents the main thoroughfares, Fore Street and Princes Street, the two parallel riverside streets, the main roads in the Lambeth village, and the houses within them. And then he ventures into some particularly muddy and dirty back courts, like York Wharf here. And almost all of his photographs are, I mean, what he's clearly trying to record in this series are the buildings and the streets that are about to disappear. But unusually in this image, he comes away with an extraordinary group photograph of family or families living in these scuzzy little back cottages in York Wharf. If you look carefully at this group, the girl in the white dress in the centre, she's standing astride an open ditch. This is the drainage. Just look at the mud. Look at the fact that all the children are barefoot. Look too at the limitations of the camera and the shutter speed. Most of those children have moved in the course of the exposure, and hardly anyone is in full focus. Nonetheless, for all its kind of photographic and technical limitations, this is an extraordinary image. It's one of my favourite images in the collection, because it is an image that captures an aspect of Lambeth, a particular class in Lambeth that would simply not otherwise been recorded. Strudwick has wandered into this dirty little back street with his enormous camera underneath a tent on four big wheels. It was such a heavy piece of kit that he was having to kind of push it around. And clearly, all the kids living in York Wharf, you know, it's a bit like when people first started owning cars in the poorer streets of Lambeth in the 1920s and 30s. The first person to come down the road with a car, everybody would come out and look at it. Well, this is kind of analogous here. Here is this strange man with an extraordinary piece of equipment on a little cart with four wheels, who's pushed his way into our back alley that nobody comes into. And of course, they've all rushed out and stood and posed. I'm sure that Strudwick just wanted to take photographs of the clapboard, the interesting clapboard upper stories and the pantiled roofs and a sense of the little courtyard. But instead, he ended up, possibly against his will, taking this extraordinary group photograph of a bunch of kids and their parents living in squalor in just across the Thames from the Houses of Parliament. The boat in the courtyard there reminds us just how close we are to the Thames. This is more familiar territory. This is what people who could afford photography in the 1860s and the 1870s and the 1880s were doing. They were documenting themselves. They were going to studios. The studios sprung up. These are just two almost random ones. Both happened to be in Clapham. Well, one on Clapham Road and one on the pavement in Clapham Common. And these were this was the photographic format of the 1870s and the 1880s. The carte de visite. Again, sense of size. Well, the clues in the name, they were roughly the same size as one's visiting card, and indeed initially they were a kind of extension of the visiting card that you might include your image of and leave your image rather than your card when you called socially. So a sense by the kind of photographic business to kind of up their game and appeal to the middle and professional classes, and just based on the dress of these two gentlemen who visited these Clapham studios. We're looking at middle class, professional class Clapham residents here. On the left's interesting in that the photographer has even engaged in a certain amount of painting, so that the gentleman has got extraordinarily pink cheeks and what's probably now a rather faded but once navy blue cravat. This was one of the two standard formats that emerged at the end of the 19th century. The carte de visite, about 3 inches by 1.5 inches, 2 inches, and then the slightly larger cabinet portrait, which was about 6 inches by 4 inches, also on a heavy card mount, and typically, as with these two examples, advertising, also serving as an advertisement for the photographer. This is a gorgeous image. This is also Clapham, and this is for those who couldn't afford to go into the studio on the pavement or down Clapham Road. Undoubtedly, this guy on Clapham Common was quite a bit cheaper and essentially doing the same job. Again, if we can zoom in on him, we can see here. This is. I was talking about Strudwick walking around with something on wheels. Cameras were large and heavy, and you particularly if you were going to be photographing out in the street, you needed wheels. What's also interesting here is the displays of the various size photographs that he could produce in the different styles. The other thing to bear in mind is that the tent structure was used for developing. It was also a portable darkroom. So our photographer here would have all the chemicals he required, and as soon as he'd shot this couple with their young child in the perambulator, he would have gone into the tent, as it were, and developed the image and sold them an or a carte de visite. Depending on how much money they were prepared to spend. So democratization of photography, it becomes not merely fashionable, but by the 1870s, available to most people with money. It's only the poorest of the poor who are not taking advantage of the photograph. Here are some of the poorest of the poor, and here are some examples of the way that charitable institutions in Lambeth were using photography. Virgin's Orphanage on Clapham Road in Stockwell. The top left image is the first 6 boys from when the orphanage opened in 1867. We can see them in their orphanage uniform. These are charitable objects, and the purpose of the photograph here is clearly not to provide the children with their own photograph. One suspects it's more to document the Virgin's philanthropy in establishing the institution and recording it. Down below on the left, there's an earlier example of that same process with the Friendly Female Almshouses in Stockwell, commissioning a portrait of their oldest resident, who I think was then aged 100 in 1848. On the right, also in the uniform of the Brixton Orphanage for Fatherless Girls, Annie Cotford, taken in 1909. She clearly was given this photo herself because it came to us as a small family archive that was passed to us. But there's something rather kind of wonderfully poignant about the Annie Cotford image. There she is in her orphanage dress and with her scuffed black shoes, which you can see in the photo, and her plate, standing in front of this extraordinary simulacrum of some kind of 18th century parkland with a bench in the foreground. It was probably somewhere just along Barrington Road where the orphanage was. But there is something also rather kind of wonderful, and particularly once one understands the context of this image, rather wonderful in the deceptions the studio photographer and their clients were keen to participate in. This is we'll see more examples of this in other studio portraits in a minute. I guess the other thing that is poignant, particularly about the two photographs here, is that for orphans as they were, these were almost certainly the first images that had ever been taken of them, respectively, and they are institutional images rather than family images. Here's another institutional-looking young lady. We know this is Florence Tegetmeier. She's number 211. But this isn't a charitable image, though there are some analogies. This is business. This is Dalton's Potteries, and this is one of the. These are all images from the extraordinary signatures booked for Dalton made in the 1880s and presented to Frederick Dalton, the head of the pottery, a decade on. All of the girls and young ladies thanking Frederick Dalton, the undersigned lady artists and assistant now engaged in the studio on the work, a desire to take the opportunity of expressing our obligation to you, the origination of an occupation at once interesting and elevating so large a number of our sex. Basically, they all had their portraits taken, and we have these in one book of a couple of hundred images. And they all had their designer mark because they were all designing art pottery in Dalton's, and each had their own signature, which would appear on the base of a Dalton pot. And in the other volume, cross-referenced with it, are their signatures. So if you have a piece of Dalton artware from the 1880s and the 1890s, you can in theory come into Lambeth Archive, identify the signature that appears on the base of your pot, and then open the other volume and discover a photograph of the young lady who designed your piece of Dalton. Back to the glorious deceptions involved in studio photography. This is a photograph taken in a Loughborough Junction back garden. I'm very fond of this image as well. Again, if we zoom in, we can see the edges of the flower beds either side of the image, and we can see the extraordinary framework that's been cut in, and here is one of the tent poles holding up this fantastic simulacrum of some 18th century parkland with spreading oak trees and a kind of distant haze in the horizon. Of course, what's actually behind it is a kind of a low brick wall and the backs of the houses in the next door street. But photography, this is a wonderful example of the way in which photography is illusion, and photography allows ordinary South London families to project a visual image of themselves. Here they are, all in their best clothes on a sunny day in Loughborough Junction, and the photographer has put up the screen behind to photograph them in front of it. It's a convention that moves across. These images also all from Lambeth Archives, but have come respectively from the West Indies, from South India, and from West Africa. We can see how the studio portrait tradition got exported to what were then British colonies and enthusiastically adopted by families out there. These two images come from the regimental archives that we hold for the 1st Surrey Rifles, part of the County of London Regiment. The first one is an image from the Boer War, or just before the Boer War, and the second one from the First World War. And I use these two images to illustrate the point about it's only at the very beginning of the 20th century that ordinary people get to be able to buy cameras, and it's only at the beginning of the 20th century that cameras become small enough to be taken, for example, as here on the right, to northern France, to a scene of operations. To take this in comparison with the other images you've looked at so far, to take this incredibly informal image of a group of soldiers, FSR, Mercenary Rifles, the old combine, somewhere behind the lines on the Western Front. The camera used was probably a Vest Kodak or one of the other similar portable cameras that were coming on the market by the time of the First World War. And one sees the same here in the image on the left, of considerably better quality, taken by a passing street photographer of these three children outside a house in Brixton. The image on the right, clearly taken by the proud owner of a new camera, not yet quite got the hang of how to take a good photograph and where to position the sunlight. It's unfortunately silhouetted image of a group of girls and young women with their dolls, again in a Brixton back garden. Sometimes archives come to us that are really poignant, and the Lobenstein family archive has to be one of those. These were a suitcase of images that were only unearthed in an attic in Herne Hill, probably 15 years ago, and passed to us. And piecing them together, what we realise is that we're holding the archive of a young Jewish girl who got sent out of Germany in 1939-40, kinder transport, effectively, and was settled with not friends, but through the German Jewish Refugee Council, settled first on Croxford Road and then on Half Moon Lane, and whose Jewish boyfriend also got out of Germany and got to New York, and this is Heinrich Bowley, who we see. He's one of the three young men in this, again, rather extraordinary studio image taken on Coney Island in 1940 and posted to Herta, which he was then living in Half Moon Lane in Herne Hill. But what's particularly poignant about this archive is that Herta was the only child to get out of Germany from this Jewish family. Was clear and had clearly been given the entire family photographic archive to take with her to Britain, as if the family knew something. So we have this extraordinary archive of a middle-class Jewish family in late 19th century and early 20th century Frankfurt, and documenting their lives alongside the later kind of anxious letters from her family before they get deported to Auschwitz, I think, and died. I suppose in some ways the saddest thing of all is that Herta herself was killed in an air raid in 1941, buried in Camberwell Cemetery. The archive itself remained undiscovered for another 60 years, 65 years before it came to us. And then on to another, it happens, a Jewish photographer, Harry Jacobs, who many of you will have heard of, who had a studio in Stockwell from the early 1960s until 1999. Indeed, these two images of him just about bracket his professional life at the studio. And rather gloriously, not only is Harry changed, albeit slightly aged after 35 years, the studio backdrop is also completely unchanged, and that became one of the defining features of Harry. So Harry Jacobs was in many ways a studio photographer like many others. There were dozens of studio photographers across Lambeth. It's just that we happen to have rescued his archive after he closed his business in 1999. We salvaged it, and we have 5,000 of his images in our collection. What was interesting about Harry was the way that he quickly became, although he was kind of Jewish himself from East London, he quickly became the default photographer for the black community in Brixton. He started off with his brother running a jewellery stall in Brixton Market, and he decided, this is from an interview that I did with him in about 2005. This is his voice. He decided that he wanted to get out of the jewellery business and thought he'd try photography, and he got hold of a rangefinder Leica camera, quite a good portable 35mm camera. And from Granville Arcade, where he worked, he would wander across Cold Harbour Lane and go on the knocker, as it was called, knocking, cold calling along Somerleyton Road and Geneva Road, which were the streets where most of the recently migrated West Indian families were then living. Well, I mean, Harry says it better than I can, but this is an example of how he started off before he got his studio. He would particularly be photographing families in their best clothes of an evening, in they're often quite cramped rooms in streets like Somerleyton Road and Geneva Road. He then acquired the studio, and clearly he was photographing anybody who came to him with business. These two images are of respectively a Greek Cypriot girl and an Irish girl. But it was unquestionably the case that Jacobs did become, as I said, the default photographer for the black community. Something like 90% of the images in the archive that we salvaged are of West Indian and West African people. And he quickly acquired a reputation, and certainly when we subsequently exhibit his material, his work tends to be presented as Harry Jacobs as a photographer of Brixton's black community. I talked earlier about anonymity, the fact that many photographs come to us simply as examples of photography, or alternatively their meaning, or their personal meanings, their family associations, perhaps even the names involved, have got lost along the way. This is absolutely the case with the Jacobs archive. We salvaged, as I said, 5,000 photographs from the walls of Harry's studio when he closed down in 1999. Every single one was anonymous. So when we've subsequently exhibited Jacobs' work locally, as we do fairly regularly, we tend to do it behind large plastic screens, and then encourage people from the local community to identify people. And very slowly we are kind of recreating the original meaning behind many of these images. We encourage people to leave post-it notes on the images, and you can see them here. Who knew these people or their families and have identified them for us. So, and that gets fed in to our catalogue. Sometimes people come to Lambeth Archives and literally find themselves. This is Lynette Reed on the right, discovering the photo that Jacob took of her 35 years earlier, when she had got a hairdressing award certificate and went to have her photo taken. This is my former colleague Marcia on the left, identifying a photograph of her uncle, seen here on the top right, who did not know existed and had never seen before. Jacobs Archive is unusual and extraordinary in a way within Brixton, because it is almost like the community archive of what were initially quite tightly knit community where everybody knew everybody. And so these sorts of images that previously we knew nothing about, have now been identified for us, and we have a better understanding of more and more of the images within the collection. Other people have been inspired by Jacobs. A couple of photographers set themselves up as Brixton Street Studio and created fake backdrops of Caribbean churches and market scenes and Caribbean islands as a sort of tongue-in-cheek homage to Jacobs' own sort of easy studio set. And their work was exhibited in the Tate, and they've since donated their own photographic archive to us. So we have the Brixton, 2006, the Brixton Street Studio archive. Here's one of the photographers, Rockwell Lido, with the Caribbean island backdrop, and I've just put that alongside the Clapham Common photo because it reminds us of that by now quite long tradition of street studio photography that taken place across Lambeth. Other artists and photographers have gone to the Jacobs collection to create their own work. The artist Holly Graham, black artist, has been fascinated by the Jacobs archive and frequently comes to us to copy material to make her own highly original work. These images of hers have been created by rephotographing hands that appear in the details of hands that appear in Jacobs' studio portraits, which he then collages to create large new works. And Harry Jacobs always said, "There's absolutely no art in it. I just press the shutter, it goes click, and I take their photo." He was absolutely gobsmacked by the idea that people would take what he was doing as he was a commercial photographer. He was a studio photographer taking portraits for people who wanted images of themselves, images to send back to their families in the Caribbean to show how well they were doing in having moved to England. People who just wanted photographs of their family at key moments in life. The idea that somehow his work should acquire some kind of retrospective evaluation as art, he found hilarious. But nevertheless, here we are. These are some of the. This is an exhibition in China in 2015-16. It toured about 30 galleries in China. It was curated by the Photographers Gallery in the West End, and they came to us and borrowed a whole load of Jacobs photos to include in this exhibition. So there's Harry Jacobs in China. When I started off, I said I'd call this talk "Private Lives and Public History," and I hope you've sort of got a sense of where I've been going with this. Those of you who listened to Len's talk last week will have come away with a bit of a sense of the kind of process that goes on when something comes into the archive, be it a document or a photograph or whatever. It is a transition from a private life to a public one. Frequently, the images that come to us, I said, are anonymous. We don't know who either of these people are. One's a Jacobs photograph. One's a somebody's family photo from the 1920s, probably on Hastings Beach or Brighton Beach. But when we catalogue these images, we're not able to talk about, was this somebody's mother? Who are these people? Where were they at the moment in life when they chose to submit themselves to the camera in this way? When we catalogue them, we talk about slightly banal physical things. We talk about how big the image is. We talk about the photographic process. We try and date it from perhaps the costume that's being worn or some context we have about it. We might note, for example, that the Jacobs image on the left isn't a colour photograph, it's actually a hand tinted photograph, which makes it actually really quite special, quite a piece of work. If you look at the extraordinary colour there, but if you look at the backdrop, you can see how the backdrop it's just colour tints. It's not colour photography, it's black and white photography, but beautifully tinted. So those are the kinds of things that we talked about. And this issue of this movement from the private to the public reminded me of a French writer on photography, Roland Barthes, whose very last book that he wrote at the end of his life, published in 1980, is called Camera Lucida, and it's his book writing about photography. I mean, he was a literary theorist and philosopher, but he was very interested in photography. And it's a book that's full of photographs taken by professional photographers that he liked, whose work he admired. There's work by Mapplethorpe in there, by Stieglitz, by Curtis, by other kind of significant figures from the 20th century. And at the end of the book, he talks about family photograph, and he talks about a particular photograph of his mother, and Barthes was peculiarly obsessed with his mother. She was hugely important to him, and when she died, it was a great loss to him. He has a photograph of his mother in a garden in Paris. He calls it he calls the photograph the Winter Garden, and he treasures this photograph, and he writes about it at length in the book. And then, deliberately, in a book that is about and includes many photographs, he refuses to include it in the book. And this is what he says: "I cannot reproduce the Winter Garden photograph. It exists only for me. For you, it would be nothing but an indifferent picture, one of the 1,000 manifestations of the ordinary. It can't in any way constitute." We then get a bit of critical theory, but you understand what he's saying. It cannot in any way constitute a visible object of science. It would not interest you. You would be reduced to talking about its period, its clothes, its photogeny. But it, for you, no wound. And whenever I'm kind of cataloguing images or looking at images in the archive, I'm reminded of that statement. I think it's a powerful statement about what happens to photography and the way it loses a certain sort of meaning as it ages and as it goes into the public collection. And these two images, as I say, both of them anonymous, seem to me to exemplify that dilemma that faces both the archivist and the user of these photographs. Because they have no core meaning anymore, what that means is that we reconstruct them to mean other things. So that nurse on the left has become, for many people, a kind of symbol of the Windrush generation. She represents Black Brixton, if you like. She's become that in the absence of us truly knowing what she once was. Okay, I'm going to finish on that note. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you've been pleasantly surprised at some of the riches that we hold in our photograph collection. And thank you for listening in on me tonight.